Welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Welcome everyone to this edition of Allow Us to Explain. My name is Jordan and I serve as the Director of Media here at ONC. In today's episode, we're taking a look back at the Russia and Ukraine war. We're taking a look at kind of where it stands right now, where the U.S. response stands, and should more funding be given in this ongoing conflict. But before we begin the conversation, I want to introduce our panelists who are joining us today. Today, we are joined by a few of ONC's conservative writers, Ryan Delaney and Cole Kinder, and special guest, former U.S. Ambassador to Cyprus, John Koenig. Ambassador, I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jordan. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a fascinating topic. I am currently instructor, an adjunct professor at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies, but I was a career Foreign Service officer for more than 30 years, retired in 2015, just as you said, from being ambassador to Cyprus. I have a lot of experience as a practitioner in European security policy. I was the deputy permanent representative of the United States to NATO. I worked in the NATO command structure, and I also worked on what are called political military affairs at senior levels in the U.S. Diplomatic missions in Germany, Greece, and elsewhere. It's kind of my specialty, American security policy in Europe.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Cole, I'll let you go next.
Oh, thank you. It's tough to follow that up because my credibility is definitely not all of that. But what I have done is I am a recent graduate from UCLA in political science. I studied international relations. I graduated summa cum laude, and that's basically where my credibility ends. I also have written one book so far on foreign relations, specifically on the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan. And yeah, that's about it for myself.
Nice. Thank you, Cole. And Ryan, I'll let you introduce yourself.
I just recently graduated from UC Riverside with a degree in political science, and I took a lot of classes focusing on international relations. And my favorite class, which I took at the end, was Russian foreign policy.
Perfect. Lovely to hear. So let's kind of dive into the conversation then. So as we're starting to approach, I believe this is going to be now the second year of the ongoing conflict. How would you three view the current state of the war right now when it comes to what's happening overseas and the U.S.'s involvement with it? Anyone can jump in first.
Well, perhaps I'll take the first gavel here. First of all, I want to say congratulations on being summa cum laude. I think that's great. And I'm very pleased to be on this podcast with three recent graduates because I think this dialogue, intergenerational dialogue about foreign policy is something that really needs to be invigorated. Where do I see the conflict right now? I think it has been described as a stalemate. I don't know if it is in military terms precisely a stalemate, but I would say the military picture is one of stasis. There has been no serious movement along the front between Russian forces and Ukrainian forces inside Ukraine for almost a year. The beyond the military picture alone, however, I think the situation is shifting in Russia's direction. I think what has become apparent is that some of the inherent strengths that Russia brought to this conflict, certainly not its argument in favor of invading Ukraine, which is an outrage, but Russia's inherent strengths as a great power with tremendous resources and extensive relations around the world are increasingly coming to bear on the conflict in Ukraine in ways that put the Ukrainian side at an increasing disadvantage. So we'll probably get into this later, but in my mind, this argues strongly in favor of looking for a new strategy for Ukraine in the West that is not predicated on the notion that Ukraine can, through military conquest, recover all of the territory it has lost to Russia since 2014.
can jump in next. I certainly agree with John that it's a stalemate and that it's certainly leaning towards Russia's favor recently, especially with indications from countries like Poland and the United States that financial aid is either running out or being reduced, especially because those are very vital sources of both military and humanitarian aid for the war effort to continue. And you see like slow movements on the front recently in places like Avdiivka, where Russia shows that it's more comfortable in the stalemate than Ukraine is. So certainly that seems like to be the situation right now.
Yeah, I would agree with both of our panelists that have spoken so far. One of the things that I'm very concerned with is right now this war has sort of become a political debate. A lot of Republicans have taken the side of not funding more for Ukraine. A lot of Democrats have taken the other side. And one thing that I'm very concerned about is right now we are trying to fund all free compact state associations with the Federate States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. That's kind of being held up in some of the budget debates right now, as well as some of our other key allies. And, in the greater scheme of things, when we look at those three countries right there, it is an area of contiguous territory that the U.S. basically controls that is the size of the continental United States in the Pacific Ocean. It's a very key region of the world, and our potential battles with the People's Republic of China, which hopefully never happen, and I don't think anybody's calling for that. So let's hope that never happens. But nonetheless, it's a big deal, and frankly, the people there are very much like us. They are very freedom-loving people. So that's something I very much am concerned with. So I think that this war has lasting consequences for people all around the world in our alliances, and especially those people right now, because it's very critical that we re-engage with them, that we get these free compact state associations re-signed, re-budgeted. Everything needs to go to plan because this is a very important part of the U.S. Just nobody really knows about it, so that's why people don't really talk about it.
A general consensus I'm hearing from all three of you is that one of the, I guess, main topics and points in this discussion is funding to the war itself, as far as being one of the key indicators for how this is going to play out. So should the U.S. Be more involved in the conflict by donating money for this, and aid for this, more money that's already been given out so far, and not the same funds that are going towards, let's say, domestic issues that more people at home are starting to be more concerned with when it comes to funding?
Well, Jordan, I would take the view that funding is really only a small part of the story, to be perfectly honest. I do think that we should provide continuing flow of funds and armaments to the Ukrainian side in this conflict. But a couple of words on this showdown that's happening in Washington. I don't quite understand why it has reached this stage. There are requests being made by the Republicans in Congress, and I'm not always sympathetic to people like Rand Paul, for example. But there are requests being made by Republicans in Congress that are reasonable, that have been rejected or ignored by the Biden administration. And at this stage in this conflict, some of these requests actually demand attention. One is the request for a strengthened system of accounting, the appointment of a special inspector general for Ukrainian assistance funds, especially those that flow to the military. And this is based on really bad experience in the U.S.-Afghanistan engagement, where the special inspector general for Afghanistan filed constant reports on how money had been misused in that conflict. And of course, we know that in the end, that conflict was a disaster for the United States. The second is that the administration present a clearer picture of what you might call the end state or the exit strategy, or basically what America is seeking to gain through its participation as a supporter of the Ukrainian side in this conflict. I don't understand why the administration can't articulate that. It's simply not enough to say, well, we're in it as long as it takes, and we're going to follow the Ukrainians' lead, when the situation is so fluid and evolving so rapidly on the ground and internationally surrounding this conflict. So that is a case where, whereas I think the the administration's funding requests are reasonable. Its political response domestically, I think, has fallen totally flat. In addition to money, though, I think we need to recognize that it's not just the flow of funds from the United States or even from some other European allies that's at risk. There is simply not enough military material stockpiled in order to sustain the current pace of operations by the Ukrainian armed forces. And this has been impossible to get past, especially since Russia has been able to augment its own capabilities through acquiring weapons from Iran and North Korea and other sources, and also to continue to receive a substantial inflow of funds from sales of petrochemicals and other goods. This inability to provide really Ukraine not higher technology weapons, but simply the basic things like 155 millimeter shells that it needs is a very, very important roadblock that will not be somehow resolved by providing additional assistance funds to Ukraine, however justified they may be.
I definitely agree. One thing I've been paying attention to the entire time this conflict has been going on has been, like you mentioned, the artillery demand on the front in Ukraine. I've seen a lot of reports saying that, like you said, the stockpiles that Western nations, including the United States, and the level of production just cannot meet the demands needed on the battlefield. And Russia is able to, not consistently, but when it needs to turn up the heat on the offensive, it has done so when it needs to. And I've seen some things saying like 70 to 80% of casualties are caused by artillery. So that's a situation that's looking pretty grim for the Ukrainian side of things, I would say.
Yes, and backing up off of that, that's one of the things that we also saw in Afghanistan. A lot of the people mention how the people of Afghanistan gave up on those state. But when you look closer into that conflict at the very end, one of the key issues is that the U.S. was, they were kind of their air support. They were providing them a lot of the weaponry. And so when we left, the Afghan forces lost a lot of the ammunitions, all of their air support, basically all of those tragedy, all of the resources that they had that we were backing them up with, they lost. So a lot of us, a lot of Americans were criticizing Afghanistan, like, oh, you got to fight for your country, without realizing they didn't really have anything to fight with. And the strategy they had didn't exist, So I think that's something that we have to look at with Ukraine. We have to look at our previous engagements and try to find a new way. And also the communication to the American people is very, very important. Right now, I don't want to say that there's Russian disinformation in the US because I think that has become a little bit too politicized at times. But I will say that we really need to communicate what this war means a little bit better than we are. Also communicate what the Ukrainian people are, especially to Republicans, because they're kind of the people that are most against this. So one of the key things that I would say is, in sort of Republican leaning media, to get people out there that are really like telling people, hey, Ukrainians are a lot of times Christian people. When it comes to politics, they're very center, sometimes center right, sometimes center left, but they're very center people. It's not like a left wing, right wing thing. It's not conservative or liberal. It's just really a group of people that want to have a democracy, want to have freedom, versus a group of people that want to take over these people. And it's more complicated than that, of course. But that's what we have to communicate, because else a lot of Republicans, they're not going to want to fund this, because to them this is like it's part of the globalist agenda. We really have to like tell people that's not what it is, or else people are going to not want to support this. So we really have to get ahead of it. We really have to communicate to the American people what this is, and communicate it to the people that would be against this better than we are right now.
Could I come in on that? Because I think this issue of messaging is one that I understand what Cole is saying, but I take a slightly different approach on it. I think the Biden administration, and I sympathize with the Biden administration, I think they have mishandled messaging on this conflict and the conflict in Gaza. And I think the situation in terms of messaging is getting worse rather than better because of this confluence of policy statements about both Gaza and Ukraine. Biden himself, I think, has framed it horribly by equating the sort of role of Hamas in Gaza with the role of Russia in Ukraine. This, I think, really kind of eviscerates the argument from the point of view of anyone who's serious about understanding international relations. One of the problems that we have is that this conflict, the one in Ukraine, and now the one in Gaza, is being portrayed in existential terms for Americans. And in fact, these are not existential conflicts for Americans. And we are not willing to go down the path of the kind of effort that we would be prepared to make if these were indeed existential. So there's a bit of a shell game going on here. There's exaggerated emotional messaging about this conflict. There is incredible lack of tolerance for the expression of alternative points of view. I mean, you expressed some concern about Russian disinformation, but I think just as big a problem as that is the rapid accusation that is made for anyone who advocates, let's say, a ceasefire or negotiations in Ukraine, that person is actually just parroting Putin's talking points and that they want to sell out the poor Ukrainian people to the Russian bear, this kind of thing. So the tolerance for rational discussion in the United States has been kind of narrowed and somehow undermined. And in fact, the administration is partly to blame for this. It's also the media. It's also sort of, I guess you would call them blowhards or sort of pundits and people who express extreme views on either side, but it's mainly, I think, the government's responsibility to try to sort of manage the conversation well, and I think it's managed the conversation poorly. And that's one reason why it is so terribly easy for Republicans on the Hill to connect Ukraine funding to border security and totally get away with it.
I agree with that, and I think that I don't know how far we're going to get into depth in this podcast, but if we do get into maybe our personal ways of maybe solving this crisis, I think you will see that I actually agree with what you're saying exactly. It's just on the communication. The reason I'm worried is just because from a Republican point of view, it seems like a lot of our resources are kind of telling us, like, oh, this is, like these people, this is a liberal agenda, this is, anti-Christian, Putin's coming to save the Christian world, that type of stuff. So that's what I'm saying, like, from a Republican point of view, it's very difficult because that's what's being communicated to us. So it's like, well, why would you ever support something like that if you were a Republican, So that's why.
Just one more thing to add on to this. I had seen, I believe it was John Kirby was talking with Ukrainian refugees at a press conference, and he was referencing how the Russian military had been targeting energy and infrastructure and widely criticizing that as horrid terror bombing. But the same administration hesitates to criticize the conflict in Israel when the same exact tactics are used. So I think that kind of messaging, like you say, really goes to show how, colluded or diluted this kind of the narrative has become for both of these conflicts. It's not very clear to the American people on either side of the aisle, right. It seems like.
Before we get into international relations on this, I do want to go ask a question to all of you, because I know you all kind of referenced the Biden administration, their lack of response or their poor response to communication-wise when it comes to this ongoing conflict. How do you think their stance and their response to this conflict could affect Biden's getting reelected, or his own election campaign, or just the election cycle of 2024 in general? How do you think this conflict will affect that here at home?
I would say negatively, and this is more important because foreign policy expertise was one of the strengths that Biden sold in his 2020 campaign against Donald Trump, and it is something that I think suffers not only from the administration's own, let's say, foreign policy shortcomings, especially the way they've handled sort of the concurrent Gaza conflicts and Ukrainian conflict, but also from the fact that I think public faith in sort of the what is usually called the foreign policy establishment, or the Washington sort of approach to foreign affairs, is I think just trending downward, especially among young people. So to the degree that Biden really needs to get young voters to turn out in relatively large numbers and vote for him in order to win the 2024 election, I think he has created a massive problem for himself by being so seemingly disinterested in the views of young voters. It's not just that he doesn't heed them and sort of alter his policy to sort of meet their demands. He doesn't even want to listen. It's pretty evident, and that does reinforce the view that he's just too old to listen to people, that he's too set in his ways and he's inflexible.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. Especially amongst younger voters, I've seen a lot of people, mainly on the left, but all across the aisle, extremely concerned with specifically the conflict in Israel recently, but also the conflict in Ukraine. And I think the Biden administration kind of aligns more with young voters in the situation in Ukraine. But they've been especially unwilling. Like if you go on the President of the United States Instagram, any post you click the comment section, the first 100 most popular comments will be regarding some kind of ignoring of genocide or something regarding the Palestinian conflict, and how there's many young voters who are unsatisfied with the messaging. So yeah, it'll certainly affect him negatively going forwards if this isn't addressed, I think.
I do think it's important, though, also to note that on those comments, do we know if those people are from the US or not, right? Because, if they're not from the US, then presumably they won't matter in terms of the election. I think that with regards to this conflict, I think the worrying thing is that if this continues to be a stalemate, then it can be framed as a forever war. And if it's framed as a forever war and the Republican candidate is against it, is trying to find a peaceful solution, and the Democratic candidate, presumably President Biden, is not, that will very much affect him. And I think another thing too is, and I don't know if anybody sees a parallel between the Vietnam War and this war, maybe not, but one thing that I do see is that President Trump is much more trusted with President Putin. He seems to be more open to the Russian point of view, and President Biden is definitely less so. A lot of the talking points coming from the Democratic media since even the Crimean annexation, which was crazy, was basically, like everything that Russia says is wrong, which is weird because, in Crimea, if you look at all of the independent polling, they always kind of suggested that those people, if they got to choose what they wanted, they would definitely choose to be part of Russia. So that was like a clear example of, okay, now it seems like our own media is not informing us correctly, right? I think that was the first example of, maybe you could say, fake news media becoming like a term that was used, right? So I think that that's another parallel that you could see, if President Trump is able to communicate to the American people, hey, I can actually create peace here because I can talk to President Putin, and it does seem to be a stalemate, a forever war, I think that the election will go to President Trump in that case.
I want to talk about strategy, something that I know quite a few of you in the call definitely have extensive research and knowledge in. When it comes to NATO's role in the conflict, what are the potential effects, if you will, of NATO's strategic purpose and priorities going forward when it comes to this conflict?
I'll take this one. I spent a long time working in and for NATO in relatively responsible positions at the end. I think that this has reinvigorated NATO in terms of its own internal solidarity. That was kind of to be expected. Ever since 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea and the Russian support to separatists in the Donbass, there has been a gradual increase in the solidarity of the NATO alliance as NATO returned to its original mission, which was territorial defense of European democracies. So that has in fact occurred. The question, I think, for Americans is a somewhat different one, and I'll get around to that in a minute. But NATO has taken a lot of steps to demonstrate that it has a kind of that it has recognized this new threat picture and that it is prepared to do what is necessary, or claims that it is prepared to do what is necessary in order to confront it more effectively and more collectively, not relying to the same degree on the United States as it has up until now. I don't believe the last part, though. I think that the way that the U.S. has in particular handled this conflict, our rush to seize the leadership of the alliance and really hold it completely in our hands over the course of the Ukraine conflict has, on the one hand, demonstrated the indispensability of the United States to NATO, but it has also, I think, reinforced the comfort zone that other allies have of living under the American security umbrella at a time when that is perhaps not entirely necessary. There are also things about NATO's response which I think are not positive. I think there should have been a debate about the expansion of NATO to include Finland and Sweden. Of course, Sweden has not yet joined because it hasn't been able to get its accession arrangements, the treaty amendment passed in all the legislatures of NATO member states, not yet. But Sweden is on the verge of joining. Finland is the bigger question, though. Finland has a very capable military and, of course, had always trained to defend itself along its eastern border against Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. But the question for Americans has got to be, does it really help us? Does it help Americans that Finland is now inside NATO and not outside NATO? Does it help? Because Finland was a very, very close partner of the United States and NATO before it joined the alliance. So is it better to have an additional 800 kilometers of direct border between NATO and Russia than it was before, when there was simply a border between Finland and Russia, and we were interested in the defense of Finland? We continuously take this view that because we, from our perspective, don't threaten anyone, we might as well move our border right up to their border and then rely on deterrence in order to sort of stare them down whenever they seek to meddle in the affairs of the countries that we have incorporated in our own hegemonic arrangements. That was what, in many ways, was happening in Ukraine. Now, I don't mean to justify at all the invasion of Ukraine by Putin and the Russians 2 years ago. However, it is pretty, I think, superficial to claim that that context of NATO expansion over the last 20 years has very little to do with the Ukraine conflict. It is at the very heart of the reasons for the Ukraine conflict, and we need to wisen up and stop enlarging NATO.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think the question of Ukraine joining NATO is a certainly central one to this conflict. Supposedly there was peace talks in April between Ukraine and Russia, and a main central tenet of that was NATO, or Ukraine, never being allowed to enter NATO. And the UK and the United States seemingly made that very clear, that they did not want Ukraine to sit at that table and talk if that was one of the essential outcomes. So for Putin, I think he's already been punished at the beginning of the war with the maximum amount of sanctions we can give to him. So he has no incentive to stop fighting, because if the end result of peace talks could be Ukraine joining NATO, and that's just leaving out how helpful that is to the United States, he's not going to want to come to the table if that's an option for Ukraine. And I think, too, that, like you mentioned with Finland, extending our border with Russia, and when I say "our," referring to NATO's border with Russia, would not be, I think one of the, I'm not sure, you would know better than me, but in NATO, I don't think you can join NATO if you have an ongoing border conflict, or I think that would make it very difficult. So this has been an ongoing border conflict since 2014. So I just don't see how that could happen feasibly, and I don't see how that would benefit the United States in any way.
I think, though, with Finland, it kind of, I agree with your guys' points, because prior to Russia launching the full-scale invasion in 2022, I think it was 12 days prior or 14 days prior that NATO stated how it was up to Ukraine to basically, decide if they want to join NATO. They wouldn't rule out Ukraine joining NATO. So I think that was definitely, that statement right there might have been the statement that led to the invasion. That might have been the last stage anyway. But with regards, though, to Finland, we're already in the Baltic nations. right? Same border with Russia. And I do think that when you look at Ukraine, I don't think that if NATO would have been in Ukraine, I don't think that this would have happened. And I do agree that us talking about Ukraine joining NATO, us talking about Ukraine joining the EU, or them talking about it, whichever way you put it, these talks, I do believe, contributed to Russia invading. But I think Russia invaded because they knew they could, because they weren't part of NATO yet. I think with regards to Finland, I think that there's a very real possibility that Russia might have invaded Finland. And now that they are in NATO, I don't think that they ever will. So I think you kind of get into like a weird situation where either you don't talk about it at all, or if you do start talking about it, you better be there. Because if you're not there, then Russia's going to take that as a threat, and they're going to say, well, we need to get there before NATO gets there, before it becomes official. So I think that's a key point. And when it comes to Finland, whether it helps the US or not, I mean, I don't know if it does or doesn't, but I would like to think it does. I would like to think of the family of nations that, sort of have very similar views, that support republics, support democracies. I think that's a key element of our existence in the world. I mean, I would say that the fact that we're able to travel to so many places, the fact that the world seems to be, I mean, maybe right now it's sort of on a downhill slope, but overall, it keeps getting better and better. I think it's a lot to do with the fact that all principles are spreading worldwide. So the protection of those principles, I believe, are key. So I do ultimately believe that Finland being part of NATO, or at least staying, a very good ally of the US, I do think that's important. I don't know if you can quantify that, but I do believe that it is, whether we can see it or not.
Can I just come in with a little bit of a riposte on that? I asked the question because I mean, frankly, Cole, you could use that logic to suggest that every country should be in NATO, and then they would all be safe. The fact is, NATO is not this sort of internally, organically coherent sort of community of nations. NATO is an alliance led by the United States based on a kind of transactional principle. And that transactional principle is that these countries subordinate their security policy to the United States in exchange for a guarantee of security by the U.S. Armed Forces. It's as simple as that. And we've seen that not only in the case of European conflicts, in this case, the one in Ukraine, it's even more evident in, let's say, Afghanistan and the NATO mission in Afghanistan. The countries of NATO had no interest really in participating in the Afghanistan war, zero. The only reason they did was because as part of the bargain that they have with the United States, they were expected to follow America's lead and deploy forces in Afghanistan. That gradually became accepted in Europe, but when it was first introduced, it was controversial. And the reason that it happened to catch on was because after Europe refused to go along with the United States for the most part with regard to the invasion of Iraq, countries like Germany and France were looking for ways to mend fences with the United States by recommitting themselves to American sort of priorities in NATO. So having worked in NATO for probably altogether 15 years, I would say I have a much less sort of rosy picture of NATO as an alliance. I think it serves American interests. I'm not in favor of withdrawing from NATO, but I am in favor of greatly reducing U.S. Security commitments in Europe as that can be somehow fulfilled by Europeans also in the context of NATO. And I think this American security guarantee, which is the only thing that Finland now has that it didn't have it before it joined NATO, is not a good deal for America.
Well, I do think that it would be nice if Europe took more of a lead. But I think with this specific example, right? I mean, one of the reasons that we're struggling to fight in eastern Ukraine is the fact that Russia claims it is now a part of Russia. Well, 4 of the oblasts at least. So, well, 6, I guess, if you include Crimea, though that's a republic. But anyway, the point is that region of Ukraine, right, now it's almost like a no-go zone for NATO directly, right? Because it is now part of Russia. So now Russia will consider that an attack on Russian soil. And I think Russia can respect that if Finland is now on NATO soil, that it's off limits too. I mean, hopefully they thought that way to begin with, but I think it now really clarifies that. I don't think I don't think NATO and Russia, or the US and Russia in this case, I don't think they ever want to directly attack one another ever. I think they always want to not do that. So I think with regards to Ukraine, the fact that they weren't in NATO meant that that wasn't a direct attack, even if it sort of was in certain instances, but it wasn't. But now that Eastern Ukraine is a part of Russia, I think that that's like, if NATO ever were to directly intervene, I don't think that we would ever go to Eastern Ukraine because of that reason. I think Russia will never go to Finland because of that reason either, even if they never would have to begin with.
Maybe.
Now, what do you all feel are the biggest challenges and opportunities for maintaining unity and coordinates within NATO in the face of this war, especially given Russia's stance with NATO?
Well, I think that one thing that ought to be done, and this has been recommended by a rather large number of foreign policy observers and pundits in the last several months, and it's something that I've believed in since much earlier in the conflict, is that the United States needs to have a more mature discussion with Ukraine about the objectives of its military operation and what are possible acceptable outcomes short of recovery of all the territory that it has lost since 2014. Probably the most prominent article that I've seen that advocates working harder on this was one that was written by Richard Haass and Charlie Kupchan that appeared in Foreign Affairs about a month ago. These two figures are like the ultimate establishment writers. And Richard Haass, after all, is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he typically has been somewhat critical of the administration and has urged them to take a less I guess, messianic approach to this fight in Ukraine, and one that is more built on diplomacy rather than on military victory alone. So I think that clearly the time is not right at this date to open talks with Russia, but nor is the time right to sort of continue to maintain that, we'll just fight as long as it takes, and military victory being the only acceptable outcome. Military victory is perhaps totally unrealistic, and the longer this conflict extends, the larger the risks and the costs are to not just the United States, but to the global economy. So I think that we need to rethink our approach to this conflict, one that is not, we should not be in this for a long war. We should be looking to shorten this conflict. That has also been a position that's been taken by a number of scholars from the RAND Corporation now for about a year or a year and a half, that the lengthening of this conflict comes at great risk and great cost to our side and the Ukrainian side, perhaps even more so than the Russian side.
One thing I found that was interesting, especially at the beginning of the war, is you have NATO states, heads of those states, like France and Germany, who kind of immediately wanted to take that route of diplomacy, and they were not as so willing to embrace this concept of military victory over Russia. And then UK and the United States seemed more willing to push that agenda, and it won out because, as you've mentioned, the United States is in charge of NATO. I think one thing that's become obvious is like a nation like Poland or Finland, if invaded by Russia, would fare a lot better than Ukraine because those are NATO states. And beyond the protections promised, like they have much better military hardware and training and capacity. So Russia would struggle, as they are struggling now in Ukraine, to go any further. There's some people who suggest Putin would take all the land up to the English Channel if he could, if we let him, but that's it's not feasible. He can't even cross the Donbass. So yeah, I think that cooperation within NATO needs to change, especially just looking at, the biggest threat to NATO is Russia, and looking at how Russia is faring and what their militaries are doing. The European states, especially the ones bordering it, but all the ones in Europe in general, should be reassessing how much they need to be contributing to this. And the United States should be reassessing, how much of this should be military focused and how much of this is achievable through diplomatic means. Because I think, as you mentioned, if that approach was taken, I think we would see a lot different conflict right now.
Yeah, I agree with both of our panelists. And I would say one more thing too. Um, One of the things that I see across the Western world, which includes NATO, is there seems to be such a political divide. We just saw the recent elections in the Netherlands, for example, very surprising to some. But I think what we really need to do is we really need to start trying to understand each other's differences and respecting those. One of the key tenets of the European Union is subsidiarity. It is a fundamental principle of Christian democracy, which was one of the main political positions across a lot of Central and Eastern Europe after the Cold War and after World War II, in fact, with Western Germany. I think we really need to look into that because there are certain countries like Poland and even Hungary, even though Hungary sometimes seems like they're not really on our side anymore, but they are. I think we really need to look at all of these places and understand that we all live in a different world with different perspectives. If we really believe in this concept of liberal democracy, we need to respect each other's views, and we need to understand that those certain principles that we shouldn't have decided at the European Court of Human Rights, or we should leave to the different countries or even the different states with our own country to decide. I think we need to really look into that so that way we can have unity, amidst a division of opinions, but unity nonetheless with the ultimate goals of each nation, which is to be free.
And to kind of start to wrap up this conversation, kind of this final question I have for you all. Cole kind of hinted at this earlier on in the podcast. What does the future of this conflict look to you? This includes the potential long-term effects of the continuing sanctions against Russia, especially from the G7 countries, and as well as any more solutions that you all can think of that should be either used or should be contemplated in this war. What does that future look like to you?
Well, I think we're kind of at a fork in the road, I would say, because right now these kinds of discussions are going on. There is an acknowledgement that we are choosing essentially between two or maybe three ways forward, and there are strong voices coming out in support of each of these alternative paths. The first, of course, is escalation. This is the one that bothers me the most, but there are a lot of voices coming out of Washington, especially think tanks like the Hudson Institute, that advocate escalation, that, if we're not succeeding, or if Ukraine is not succeeding on the battlefield under its current approach, it simply needs to use a lot more weapons against a lot more strategically relevant targets, mainly in Crimea, and perhaps far more attacks inside Russian territory. I don't think that aligns at all with American interests. The worst outcome for this is escalation into a direct war between Russia and the United States, and that's one that would be vastly more destructive than anything that's happening in Ukraine, including for Ukraine. So I think that's a very poor way of looking at it. The second is basically to just keep doing what we're doing. This is the administration's position. It seems to lack any kind of rational justification when you confront the fact that what we're doing is not succeeding. To say we ought to just double down on it is kind of silly, but it's typical. This is what we did in Afghanistan. It's what we did in Vietnam. It's what we did in Iraq. It's what we did my entire career, and I was working specifically on political military affairs. It's a huge mistake. So I think that's another mistake. The last one is to look for alternative approaches. Look for ways to conclude this conflict more quickly on minimally acceptable arrangements for Russia and Ukraine. Some of these involved potential EU accession for Ukraine before it recovers its territories. Certainly we have in the case of Cyprus, a case I know well, that Cyprus was admitted to the European Union even though it has a territorial dispute over the northern third of the island with Turkey. So that is conceivable. It also has traditionally been less threatening in the perception of Russia because the role of the United States in the European Union is sort of subsidiary, secondary, not particularly central. I think ideas about providing some kind of American-based, essentially, security guarantee for Ukraine are non-starters. It would have to be something that was more international, that did not so quickly sort of create dynamics that would lead to renewed conflict, and that did not so directly implicate the United States in any kind of outbreak of hostilities that might occur post-arrangement in Ukraine. But these ideas are the ones that need hard work, and they need to be discussed, I think, seriously at a high level, including at the level of Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and CIA Director, and so forth. A lot of work needs to be going on these. But in fact, I think what we're doing is more of the doubling down. So my hope would be that we move toward alternative solutions. Now, what do I think will happen if we don't find a way to shorten this war? The US's position in the world will simply deteriorate over time, and the position of Ukraine in this war will get worse. We've seen, there's an excellent article that just came out in Prospect, which is a very prominent British journal by a scholar from Yale University, Samuel Moy, I think is his name, Moyne, that U.S. Sort of credibility in international affairs has deteriorated substantially over the last 2 years. I don't blame Biden particularly for this, but this is because of the way that the U.S. has interacted with the world and the kinds of events that have occurred. We also saw the same thing from Ian Bremmer, by the way, in foreign policy recently. And Ian Bremmer is a very, very well-respected sort of commentator here domestically. I think that we need to make different choices, or we're going to see our own room for maneuver across the globe narrowed by the fact that countries will simply disregard what the United States wants. You can never ignore us completely, but our credibility is drifting downward, and I think our position that we will define our sort of line in the sand and defend it no matter how few American interests are involved is not realistic. I don't believe, for example, that we would actually ever move to put forces directly in Ukraine. So holding out that prospect as a possible outcome if there's escalation from the Russian side, I think is a lie. I'm not even convinced that America's Article 5 guarantees to European countries, our European allies in NATO, is 100% ironclad. I don't think those countries think it's 100% ironclad. That's why they bother to send troops to Afghanistan, for example. So I think we need to recognize that this system of sort of having our way and sort of swinging our sway based on deterrence has kind of run its course, and the deterrence effect of American policy is diminishing.
Yeah, I think, like you had mentioned, if this conflict continues the way it's going, especially with Western support, I'd written a couple articles on the topic that Ukraine, the situation in the stalemate looks very grim. So if there's not a diplomatic solution that is looked for or even pursued in a realistic way, then Russia will just basically bide its time and slowly grab as much ground as possible. They've shown they're willing to do it. Their political ramifications within Russia have not been, they just got rid of Prigozhin when they felt like it was necessary, and then they just keep moving along. Western countries can't do that. We don't have that same kind of civilization that they seem to have in Russia. But I think realistically, the best outcome for Ukraine would be retaining some level of sovereignty, most likely in Western and Central Ukraine. I think the odds of regaining any of the territory that's been lost from Russia, the counteroffensive that just happened in the summer, happened at the height of what is likely to be like the most money their military is going to get, and it failed. So the idea that continuing this the strategy that we're using now is going to somehow undo that doesn't seem realistic. But I do think, like you had mentioned, if we pursue things diplomatically and get realistic concessions to Russia that are satisfying to them, and especially like international cooperation in this, not United States-led diplomatics, like other European states specifically, or maybe states that are more willing, Russia's more willing to allow to participate in the conversation. I think somehow this conflict could come to a peaceful end soon, but unless that happens, I don't think that will happen.
I agree with both of our panelists, and I actually sort of have a specific strategy. I think that we have to look at one key reason, I would say, three key reasons I think that the U.S. Foreign policy has sort of deteriorated in its credibility. I think one of them was our invasion of Iraq. It was not justified by a lot of our allies. It was not justified by the United Nations. It was really not justified by anyone but ourselves and a few others, like the United Kingdom. I mean, even Pope John Paul II went against it, and he was respected by basically everyone. So that probably was a big no-no that we should have listened to. So that sort of destroyed our credibility of following the international rules-based order because we didn't follow it. And then when we went into Afghanistan, we went in on behalf of the de jure government of Afghanistan, or what basically became the representatives, the Northern Alliance. And instead of communicating that to everybody, and I know that we communicate a little bit, but instead of really hardening on that, the way it was communicated to the U.S. and around the world is basically it was the U.S. against Afghanistan. So then that kind of became Iraq number two. And then when Russia helped out Syria in a similar situation to us helping out Afghanistan, even though Syria's government was much worse and doing much worse things, nonetheless, it was the same example because they're helping out the de jure government there. And then, we help out the rebels. So like each time when you're supposed to be the rules-based order person, you're supposed to have some sort of neutrality, some sort of, we're going to follow the rules that we've set forth, and everybody else is going to have to follow those rules too. But when we stop following the rules, then why should any of these other countries follow the rules? And they already are not following the rules a lot of times, but now there's an excuse. There's a direct example of us not following the rules. I think with regards to Russia, this really comes up because, like I talked about earlier, Crimea is a great example. You can look at Western polls, you can look at Russian polls, Ukrainian polls, polls within Crimea itself. All of them always suggested that Crimea should be a part of Russia, right? And so when we look at Kosovo and we give Kosovo independence, basically, right? And then we don't allow Crimea to decide it. That's another case of us not following our own status quo that we've created, which is the vote of self-determinations in these areas. I know they're a little bit different. I understand that. But I mean, to the regular person, you can't really look at these, it's like when you get those contracts with your iPhone, you're not reading all of it. You know what I mean? That's how everybody else is with foreign policy. And I think the last part is with regards to this topic, right? I think the best way we can go forward, either we have a new president that can do this, which would be perfect for us in this case. I'm not saying we should have a new president. I'm just saying in this specific case it would be. Or President Biden really has to be very different in the next 4 years. What we have to do is, I think the best case scenario is to give ourselves more credibility once again, have 6 different votes in the occupied areas, the 4 oblasts that are occupied, plus Crimea and Sevastopol. Sorry, sometimes pronunciations is not my strong suit when it comes to Ukrainian places. But anyway, so these places, I say we have 6 votes of self-determination, okay? And because if you look at the polls, right, after Euromaidan, after the Revolution of Dignity, a lot of these areas, they wanted more autonomy. They wanted more federalism. Well, some of them wanted federalism, some of them wanted more autonomy, kind of similar, a little bit different, but kind of similar, right? But they all wanted to be Ukrainian. That's what they all wanted to be. They did not want to be Russian. Crimea and Sevastopol, somebody help me out with the city.
Sevastopol, yeah.
Yes. Thank you. These 2 areas did want to be Russian. That is true. But the other areas absolutely did not want to be Russian. So here's what you do. I think you hold a vote of self-determination. Your best chance to get these places back is that Crimea and the city of special significance, this other city, if they both vote to be part of Russia, which is expected, right? Maybe these 4 places vote to be part of Ukraine. Maybe they don't. But either way, and you give them also a vote of independence. If they vote to be independent, you demilitarize both areas. Either no Russians or no NATO forces, though, or maybe both. I don't know. But, something that gives both sides the same level. If they vote to be a part of Ukraine, what you do is sort of a Good Friday agreement in Northern Ireland, right? What you do is that you don't allow any Western forces in those areas, right? That's a guarantee that you give. If they go to Russia, well, Western forces won't be there anyway. And I think that's how you really got to communicate with both sides, because I'm actually going to be writing a piece on this, so it would be probably more clarified when you can see it in writing. But I feel like we need to find a way to give Russia dignity too, right? I mean, President Putin is a person who, he's a leader, right? He wants to be seen as credible. He wants to be seen as strong. We got to give him an out too, because if we don't give him an out, he might want to continue the war too, which would defeat this whole purpose. So if we allow these places to have voter self-determination, if we're comfortable with the fact that they're going to vote for Russia, or even if the election is rigged and they vote for Russia, then I think it will give us credibility if we allow those places to go to Russia. And the reason why is because now it'll look like, okay, now the US is applying their rules to themselves now. I think it will give us, and maybe, I don't know how many years of credibility, but it will give us a lot of credibility that we lost when we went into Iraq and when we didn't communicate why we went into Afghanistan.
Well, I want to give my thanks to John, Cole, and Ryan for taking part in this very lively discussion on this very important topic and this very important ongoing conflict that we're seeing. So we'll definitely be touching upon this more so as the war continues. Hopefully we'll get out of the stalemate that's in there now. Hopefully there'll be some changes. Hopefully some of those changes that you all are hoping for, predicted, hopefully those may come true. But I definitely want to give my thanks to all of you for being part of this. Allow us to explain. We'll be back in the new year with some new episodes, so make sure you're tuned to that. But in the meantime, make sure you're following us on social media and as well as Spotify and all your favorite podcast platforms. So we'll see you then.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.